It's a humid May morning in Tulagi, the Solomon Islands. Rear Admiral Kiyohide Shima watches as his troops hustle on the docks, unloading supplies and equipment from the ships that brought them. The air buzzes with excitement as they establish a vital base for the Imperial Navy. Just as the final crates are set ashore, they notice the rumble of aircraft engines in the distance. Shima steels himself, aware that the operation's success hinges on rapidly securing the island. In December 1941, Japan launched simultaneous surprise attacks on Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Pearl Harbor. Japan's strategy was to eliminate British and American forces from Southeast Asia and establish self-sufficiency by securing resource-rich territories. By early 1942, Japan had successfully taken control of several key regions, including the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. They planned to use these areas as defensive perimeters to protect their empire from Allied counterattacks. Following the capture of Leh and Salamaua in March, American air attacks disrupted Japanese advances, leading to a pause until reinforcements could be gathered. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was the key figure shaping Japan's naval strategy. Known for his aggressive and risk-taking nature, Yamamoto strongly believed in naval air power and commanded the combined fleet starting in 1939. He focused on a decisive battle at Midway, sidelining the South Pacific campaign. But not everyone agreed. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, commander of the 4th Fleet and an advocate of air power, had overseen the successful capture of Guam and Wake Island. He proposed further expanding Japan's control by occupying Tulagi in the Solomon Islands and Port Moresby in New Guinea to extend the range of Japanese aircraft over northern Australia. Port Moresby was a vital Australian-American stronghold situated on the southeastern coast of New Guinea, just across the Coral Sea from the Australian mainland. Despite reservations about expanding into the South Pacific, Yamamoto approved the attack on Port Moresby. This plan, known as Operation MO, aimed to secure the port by May and establish further bases to cut communication lines between Australia and the US. Following the completion of this operation, plans were set in motion for an offensive targeting the Midway and Aleutian Islands, designed to entice the remnants of America's Pacific Fleet, particularly its aircraft carriers, into a deadly trap. The Japanese prepared a large invasion force, with Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue conducting operations from a distance from his base in Rabaul. The invasion force included 11 transport ships carrying 5,000 soldiers and 500 naval troops. This fleet, led by Rear Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka, set out on May 4th, aiming to reach Port Moresby by May 10th. Supporting this invasion was the Tulagi Invasion Force, led by Rear Admiral Kiyohide Shima, which targeted the Solomon Islands with a similar group of ships. But these two invasion forces, supported by a close cover force, were just a minor part of a much larger Japanese fleet. Beyond the invasion and close support units, Japan's force included the important covering group led by the seasoned Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto. He began the war leading Cruiser Squadron 6, which comprised the Imperial Japanese Navy's 4 oldest heavy cruisers from the Furutaka and Aoba classes. He was an experienced commander, and since the start of the war he already conducted operations against key locations, including Guam, Wake, and Rabaul. Goto's group was tasked with safeguarding the Port Moresby invasion force and comprised the light aircraft carrier Shoho, 4 cruisers, and a destroyer. Originally launched as an oiler and later converted into a submarine tender, Shoho was modified into a 30-plane carrier just months prior. Besides Goto's force, there was a carrier striking force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi. Takagi, a former submarine specialist, transitioned to the Surface Navy in 1937 and gained flag rank in 1938. By 1941, he commanded the 5th Cruiser Division, leading its powerful Myoko-class cruisers. He played a key role in Japan's victory at the Battle of the Java Sea in February. Now, he commanded the MO Carrier Striking Force, despite having never worked with carries. Acknowledging this, he delegated carrier operations to the experienced Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara, the commander of the 5th Carrier Division. Hara emerged as the key Japanese commander. Known for his fiery temperament, he earned the nickname King Kong. A surface warfare officer, he took command of the 5th Carrier Division by September 1941. This included the Imperial Japanese Navy's 2 newest and most advanced aircraft carriers, the Shokaku and Zuikaku. This division played a role both during the attack on Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raid. By May 1942, Hara had amassed considerable carrier experience in a remarkably brief period. Interestingly, the captains of the 2 primary Japanese carriers at Coral Sea deviated from the traditional practice of having aviators in command. Captain Yokogawa Ichihei commanded the carrier Zuikaku, while Captain Jojima Takagi led the carrier Shokaku. These large carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were accompanied by 2 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers. These sister carriers, completed the previous year, were larger and better armored than any Japanese aircraft carriers that had come before them, each capable of carrying 72 aircraft. They were powerful and well-balanced carriers. Designed without treaty restrictions, they featured a large air group, high speed, good protection, and excellent offensive and defensive capabilities, marking them as the most advanced carrier design until the Essex class emerged in 1943. In early 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force was at its peak, with 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, the Soryu class, and the Shokaku class dominating the Pacific. Supported by light carriers like Hosho, Ryujo, and Taiyo, the fleet had yet to face the US Navy's carriers and held a clear numerical and qualitative advantage. Japanese carriers were designed for offensive operations, emphasizing finding and striking enemy carriers first with their longer-range, lighter aircraft. The Kido Butai combined multiple carriers for coordinated strikes, giving the Japanese an early advantage. However, by mid-1942, aircraft shortages began affecting carrier air groups, especially on light carriers like Shoho, which was not filled to capacity anymore. Japanese carrier aircraft such as the A6M0 fighter, D3A Val dive bomber, and B5N Kate torpedo bomber had excellent range and performance, but lacked protection, making them vulnerable to damage despite their initial successes. Furthermore, these carriers lacked radar, making air defense subject to visual detection and estimates. Fighter squadrons were tasked with patrols, but with no radar, only a few planes could stay airborne, relying on visual detection. Additionally, poor quality radios hampered effective fighter coordination. Japanese anti-aircraft gunnery was inadequate compared to the US Navy. The primary anti-aircraft weapon, the Type 89 5-inch gun, was limited by its fire control and barrage fire training, unsuitable for fast-moving targets like dive bombers. The Type 96 25mm gun also struggled, unable to handle high-speed aircraft due to slow targeting and ineffective shells. Meanwhile, by April, the US and British codebreakers had unraveled parts of Japan's naval codes. Their intelligence efforts unveiled plans for a Japanese offensive aimed at Australia. Despite being short on carriers due to the Doolittle raid, a bombing campaign targeting Tokyo conducted by the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Texas-born commander of the US Pacific Fleet, decided to gamble on the element of surprise. Chester Nimitz became the commander of the US Pacific Fleet on December 31, 1941, after graduating from the Naval Academy in 1905 and gaining experience primarily with submarines. His calm demeanor led to his selection over more senior admirals following the Pearl Harbor attack. On April 3rd, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Ocean areas, overseeing operations across the North, Central, and South Pacific. However, this new command structure complicated his authority, as he had to share command in the South Pacific with Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, who'd not yet arrived by the time of planning this operation. Upon learning of Japan's offensive, Nimitz's aggressive nature emerged. He pressed for the deployment of a second carrier to counter Japanese expansion in the South Pacific, ultimately proposing that all Pacific Fleet carriers be sent to the region for a decisive carrier battle. Admiral William Halsey, who was still en route from the Doolittle raid, would likely not return in time for the battle. The surface force was clustered in what would become Task Force 17, commanded by the Iowa-born, seasoned, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Graduating from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1906, Fletcher initially served on destroyers and earned the Medal of Honor during the U.S. occupation of Veracruz in 1915. By the time the war broke out, he commanded Cruiser Division 6, but his transition to carrier operations was abrupt due to the war's onset, as he had no prior aviation experience and had been rejected for transfer to naval aviation due to poor eyesight. Despite this, Fletcher became one of the Navy's most seasoned carrier commanders through several months of experience. His leadership style was controversial. He faced criticism for a perceived lack of aggressiveness, especially during operations like the relief of Wake Island and the Guadalcanal landings. Nevertheless, he was willing to take calculated risks. Fletcher delegated tactical control of the carrier task force to Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, who commanded the Lexington Task Force. Although junior to Fletcher, Fitch had substantial carrier experience, having qualified as a pilot in 1930 at age 47, earning him the nickname Johnny Come Lately. He had commanded 2 carriers and 2 naval air stations, proving to be a competent naval officer. The captains of the 2 American carriers, Yorktown and Lexington, were both naval aviators. Captain Elliot Buckmaster of Yorktown was known for his seamanship and for fostering an environment that allowed his aviators to experiment, leading to one of the fleet's best air groups. Captain Frederick Ted Sherman of Lexington had commanded the ship for 2 years, enhancing its efficiency and advocating for the concentration of multiple carriers in a single task force. Supporting these forces was Australian Rear Admiral John Crace's Task Force 17.3. His forces included cruisers Australia, Hobart and Chicago, along with destroyers Perkins and Walkie. The US Navy's fleet carrier force was numerically equal to Japan's, but the 2 forces differed in operational strategies, aircraft capabilities, and personnel training. The US Navy had developed carrier aviation since the 1920s, with 7 fleet carriers in service, built around 2 main classes, including the Lexington class. By 1940, Lexington, affectionately known as Lady Lex, had been modernized with a wider fore and a CXAM radar. It was heavily armed with anti-aircraft weapons, including 5-inch guns and quadruple 1.1-inch mounts, and featured an 888-foot flight deck with a capacity for 71 planes. The Yorktown, completed in 1936, boasted an impressive 824-foot flight deck and was equipped to carry 72 aircraft. They were the first modern US Navy fleet carriers, serving as a foundation for the later Essex class. These 20,000-ton ships featured improved protection, including a 4-inch side armor belt over critical areas and vertical protection over machinery spaces. Their design emphasized efficient flight operations with a large hangar deck, 3-deck elevators, and roller curtains to speed up aircraft launches. The class also had a robust anti-aircraft defense, with 8 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 1.1-inch quadruple mounts, and machine guns. By the Battle of Coral Sea, Yorktown received upgraded 20mm guns and radar technology, specifically the CXAM air search radar. US carrier air groups consisted of 4 squadrons: fighter, scout, dive bomber, and torpedo. The F-4F Wildcat was the main fighter, compensating for its inferior performance to the Japanese Zero with superior gunnery and tactics. The SBD Dauntless dive bomber was a key asset, known for its bombing accuracy. The outdated TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, hampered by unreliable torpedoes, highlighted the weaknesses in US carrier strike capabilities early in the war. The Royal Australian Air Force's 11th and 12th Squadrons, each at half strength with a total of 6 PBY Catalina aircraft, were stationed on Tulagi until May 2nd. The 32nd General Reconnaissance Bomber Squadron operated Hudsons, while the 75th Squadron, stationed at Port Moresby, had 3 operational P-40 aircraft as of April 30th. Overall, the 4 squadrons had 30 operational aircraft at the start of the battle. On April 28th, Japan established a seaplane base at Shortland Island, deploying 5 long-range H-6K4 flying boats for scouting. Its Tulagi invasion force departed Rabaul on April 29th, followed by the MO carrier striking force on May 1st. That same day, Fletcher rendezvoused with Fitch's Task Force 11, located 300 miles south of Tulagi. A few days later, Crace's flotilla merged into what would become Task Force 17 under Fletcher's overall command. As Fletcher steered toward the Coral Sea, Halsey arrived in Pearl Harbor only to learn he would soon set off for the South Pacific. He immediately embarked on a grueling 3,500-mile race across the Pacific to the Coral Sea. Should he arrive in time to engage, he would assume command of all 4 carriers, including the Yorktown and Lexington. However, he was still 6 days away from reaching the battle zone. On May 2nd, a scout plane from the Yorktown reported a Japanese submarine surfacing directly ahead of the task force. 3 additional patrolling aircraft quickly converged on the scene, deploying bombs in an attempt to engage the enemy. However, the submarine managed to evade capture and reported the presence of the Americans. Shortly thereafter, Fletcher received intelligence of enemy vessels to the northwest. The Lexington force was still in the process of refueling when Fletcher decided to advance with his own group to intercept the approaching Japanese. This move, however, left the US carrier groups dangerously separated by nearly 100 miles and out of contact due to strict radio silence. The following day, Japanese forces under Rear Admiral Kyohide Shima occupied Tulagi and the Solomon Islands without opposition, as the small Australian garrison evacuated beforehand. The Japanese immediately began constructing a seaplane and communications base. Shima found his troops in a vulnerable position, lacking the vital air cover it once had. The light carrier Shoho had moved northward to protect the convoy destined for Port Moresby, while the MO carrier striking force remained near Rabaul, entangled in a difficult ferry mission. Fletcher learned of the invasion in the evening. It prompted him to hasten his advance northward, opting to proceed independently rather than waiting for Fitch or Crace. This maneuver split his forces even more, rendering them vulnerable to a substantial Japanese offensive. On the morning of May 4th, shortly after 7 a.m., Yorktown launched 12 Devastator torpedo planes and 28 Dauntless dive bombers, flying without the protection of fighter escorts. The poor weather conditions worked in their favor, providing heavy cloud cover for most of their journey. As Yorktown's planes headed north, Admirals Fitch's Task Force 11 and Crace's Task Force 44 prepared to close the 250-mile gap separating them from Fletcher. On that quiet morning in Tulagi Harbor, several Japanese ships lay anchored as troops on land were busy unloading their vessels. The large mine layer Okinoshima and 2 destroyers stood out as prime objectives. At 8:15 a.m., Lieutenant Commander William O. Birch's force arrived near Tulagi. The bombing raid against Shima's forces commenced soon after. The Devastators, tasked with launching torpedoes, proved ineffective, managing to hit only 1 minesweeper. The first wave lasted only a few minutes. Among the notable outcomes of this first wave was the crippling of the destroyer Kikuzuki, which later had to be beached and ultimately lost. The assault continued. By noon, 27 dive bombers and 11 torpedo bombers launched a second attack, targeting installations across the island. A third wave followed with 21 dive bombers. Adding to the effort, a group of 4 fighters was dispatched to strafe the Type 97 flying boats and the newly established seaplane anchorage. Although the bombing raids initially seemed promising, most bombs and torpedoes did miss their target. By nightfall, the day of bombing raids was over. Fletcher received hopeful reports from his aviators, who had inflated their success. He relayed to Nimitz that he had sunk 2 enemy destroyers, 4 patrol craft, 3 gunboats, and a cargo ship, while severely damaging a light cruiser and half a dozen Type 97 flying boats. However, reality was far more sobering. In total, the destroyer Kikuzuki, 3 light minesweepers, and several smaller vessels were obliterated. The Japanese lost 87 killed and 124 wounded. Perhaps the most significant achievement was the elimination of 5 Type 97 flying boats, depriving the Japanese of valuable reconnaissance assets. This came at the cost of 3 US aircraft. After striking Tulagi, Fletcher retreated south at high speed, evading Japanese retaliation. Although no major damage was done, the airstrike on Tulagi prompted a swift reaction from the Japanese, who now recognized, with considerable alarm that at least one American carrier was operating in the vicinity. Far to the east, Japanese Admiral Takagi's striking force with the carriers Zuikaku and Shokaku was advancing rapidly across the Pacific Ocean, aiming to cut off any Allied vessels in the region. Following a separate but converging path, Japanese Admiral Goto's fleet maneuvered to position itself along the western side of the Solomons, hoping to trap the Allied forces between them. History's first aircraft carrier battle was about to break out. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please leave a like, it really helps out the channel. If there is a topic, battle, or person you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also like to thank all my patrons and channel members for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and you want to support my work, consider joining me on Patreon. For just $1 per month, you will already gain early access to all my videos without any in-video advertisements. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.